because it's uneven.
Yeah.
Okay.
Otherwise, I have a feeling I need to be leaning over on the side.
So you were talking about, before we were interrupted, you were talking about that McNamara wrote a book about how
He wrote an apologia of his time as a Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. And it infuriated, of course, veterans, and it infuriated the foreign policy community of the United States, who had long ago realized that this was an error. And this war was kept going for years, during which Americans died and Vietnamese died, to continue a mythology of false assumptions, notably the domino theory. And I remember it was an awkward time between myself and my otherwise very beloved and admired father, which is, you could say, what the hell are we doing in Vietnam? And he would reiterate the domino theory. And, I'd been in Vietnam and gone to school in Vietnam. And indeed, the French, who had their headquarters in Saigon in South Vietnam, north of Saigon, in the hill country of the Moi tribe, wonderful people, darker skin, different from the Vietnamese, very hardy folks. The French had built a charming town called Dalat, D-A-L-A-T, when it was hot as hell. There was no air conditioning and humidity was approaching 95%. In the monsoon seasons, you'd get the hell out of Saigon and you'd go to Dalat and you'd be up at 4,000, 5,000 feet. There were tall pine trees and it was cool. I actually built a small reservoir for this town, created a charming little lake, and installed sailboats that were made in Switzerland, and had a little teeny yacht club. And here you are in Southeast Asia with only Ferengi actually knowing how to sail again. The Moi tribesmen certainly didn't sail any more than if you introduced sailing sports to the Navajo. It'd be kind of not part of their tradition. The American Protestant missionaries had established a school in Dalat to educate their own children. So it was a school run by Americans for American children that taught the Calvert school system, which is a set of cardboard boxes you can get full of books, and you could homeschool your child from kindergarten through high school. Next door to this missionary school was a building, a very nice villa built by the French, decorated a little bit like a Charles Adams house. And it's a lugubrious looking building, and it was filled with overstuffed Victorian furniture and dark red velvet curtains and such that had been used by the American embassy in Saigon as a vacation retreat house. People in the embassy in Saigon could go there while it was still French Indochina, and go there and spend a weekend or spend a week. And there were servants who were paid for by the American embassy. And I was allowed to go over to that house and sneak through the fence from the missionary school, and the Vietnamese servants would say, Mr. David, and they would offer me tea or a sandwich or whatever it is I reasonably wanted. And when Dad was no longer deputy chief of mission of the embassy in Saigon, but was named the U.S. ambassador to Cambodia, a small high-winged observation plane, very light observation, with tandem seating. This is to say, the pilot sat in front of you and you sat behind him, and the aircraft was as wide as your seat. It's a very small airplane. He would fly up from Saigon to Dalat. I would take one of the 3 taxis in Dalat from the missionary school to the airport, and then be flown at a kind of 45-degree angle toward the southwest, to Cambodia. So it'd be I and a pilot, and it gave me a lot of opportunities to learn how to fly and land this airplane and stuff like that. That was kind of fun. And it was something which a 12-year-old would take for granted, but in hindsight is really kind of marvelous. You know, it says, yes, your dad will send the plane for you. And he would fly across all this jungle territory and such. And increasingly, it was interesting to look down because the French were getting their brains beaten out. I mean, people were fighting and dying down there.
Oh.
And
You're lucky you didn't get shot out.
so yeah, so you look down with some interest, but not heavily tinged with fear, but never some concern, looking for any incoming fire and such.
What years was your father the ambassador to Cambodia?
I could look that up, and I mean it's very easy to find on the website of the State Department.
When did the Khmer Rouge overthrow?
We were long gone from there. We were not anywhere in Southeast Asia at that point.
Where did you go after Cambodia?
Washington, D.C. It was a fairly typical routine of, you know, you're stationed in a foreign country for 2 years, 3 years, 3.5 sometimes, depending. Sometimes someone might last longer, and then you'd be sent back to Washington, and in Washington you'd reintegrate to. There's no servants in the house. You actually help your mother wash the dishes. You take out the trash. You mow the grass.
That's good though.
Yeah, it is good. But there's always a sharp contrast between living overseas, where, you know, Marine Guards are snapping to attention to your father's arrival. There's a chauffeur, there's a Cadillac, it's all government-owned stuff, and, you know, you're living in a very nice house and there are servants. To you go to a house on 3919 Foxhall Road, and if there's grass that is getting long, you need to go to the garage and fire up the lawnmower. Actually, that's not true. I don't think we ever had a powered lawnmower ever. There's always the push kind, you know.
That was in your later life.
But, you know, you could get pretty quickly used to saying, oh, Hélène, could you iron this shirt, please? And you'd hand it to somebody, you know, whatever. It's like, reach out. There'd be a hand that would take it. Or if you wanted something, you could reach out and there'd be a cup of coffee in it. You know, as opposed to, no, you go to the kitchen, you get down the mug, you know, no microwaves in those days.
And then after DC...
The other reality was that living in the United States was much more expensive than living overseas, because when you were living overseas, Dad was given a housing allowance, and literally the rent was paid for. When you're living in Washington, D.C., you lost the tenant who was occupying your house as a source of income, and on which you, of course, paid taxes. And for everything, you had to go and do it yourself. You actually had to get into the car and drive to the Safeway on Wisconsin Avenue and buy your own groceries, you know. Change the light bulb, whatever. My father was dreadful with things like that. I mean, he could break a light bulb or the lamp in just replacing a light bulb. I, on the other hand, managed to blow out fuses occasionally, learning that, you know, how things work. But it got me interested in mechanical things, which stood me in wonderful stead later. Yeah.
But after Cambodia and then DC, then where did you go?
He, after Cambodia and then DC, he was named ambassador to Lebanon. Lebanon was dealing with a civil war. The country had been handed over to the French by the League of Nations, an anachronism, a pre-United Nations institution, as a trust territory, sort of like watch over these people. This was a relationship the United States had with a number of Pacific islands after World War II as well. We tried to look after the Fiji Islanders or look after, you know, Guam.
Doesn't Chris drop presents every Christmas?
Yes, and the Pacific Islands. The Christmas run from Japan.
I know that he likes to do that.
Oh, yeah. The French had decided to adopt a hideously complicated system of government which was based on a combination of Swiss ideas and Belgian ideas. And it was designed to deal in Belgium, particularly with the enormous divide that half the people of Belgium speak French and are referred to as Walloons, and the other half of the population are really quite distinct, and they speak Flemish, like a Dutch-like language, Germanic language. And Flanders and Flandersfield will figure very well in World War I as a great killing field for the Brits. So Lebanon was divided with a almost 60% majority of Christian Maronites. These are folks who are closer to Greek Orthodox than to the Roman Catholic Church, but Christian. And the other 48% or so were, in fact, Muslim. And then the Muslims divided into subgroups, whether they were Sunni or Shia, and the Christians divided into whether they were Maronite Christians or whether they were Roman Catholics, as influenced by the French. And then, as happens, the Muslims had a higher birth rate. And so at one point, the Constitution of Lebanon organized things in such a fashion that the president would always be a Maronite Christian. The Speaker of the lower house of the legislature would always be a particular kind of Muslim, and so forth. Every office, elected office, was handed out to a particular ethnicity. Mm-hmm. As the demographics changed, they became unhappy with this. It's as though you had a majority population of Alabama were all descendants of African slaves, and yet all the officials were white. At some point you go, wait a minute, we would like to have our own governor or our own lieutenant governor or attorney general or congressman or senator represent reasonably the population of Alabama. And in the case of Lebanon, they had squabbles, but what made things much worse is that the Assad family, the dictators of Syria, a much larger country neighboring and surrounding Lebanon, had decided to intervene. And so they provided surrogate troops, they provided weaponry and ammunition and explosives and such, and the civil war became hot. People were actually killing each other in great numbers. And there was a Maronite Christian called Kamil Shamoun, who was the president, the elected president of Lebanon, which country had a treaty with the United States that Lebanon could call on the United States to defend it from enemies, foreign or domestic, which were getting out of hand. And he wanted to violate the Constitution and run for re-election, and the Constitution provided for him to have one term of office, and then he would have to be out, and then after another presidential term, then he could get re-elected. He wanted to change the Constitution so he could, in fact, succeed himself. So it was a huge error, and it stirred up the Civil War into being very hot. And so he then called Dad and invoked the treaty and said that his country was being overrun by foreigners. It wasn't quite being overrun, but it was certainly true that there were indeed an awful lot of foreigners in armed insurrection against the government of Lebanon, who perceived it as a Christian takeover and violation of the Constitution in favor of Christians and against Muslims, who were, and by now, approaching a majority of the population.